Thank you, everyone. And thank you to everyone for joining today. And with that, we can get started with our discussion. As Kiran Garu said, today's topic is about business law. We will be discussing nuts and bolts of starting a business, what to expect, what to do, what are the requirements on a general basis, as well as any pitfalls and risks to watch for. We have our guest today, Tabitha David, a business and corporate attorney based out of Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you very much, Tabitha, for taking your time out. I know it's a very busy time of the year now, especially with the long weekend coming up. So I appreciate everyone being here today. To give a little background about Tabitha, she has over 9 years of legal and business experience and has consulted on a variety of matters, including business partnerships, franchise law, capital raising, and business contracts. Previously, she's worked in pharmaceuticals, in mergers and acquisitions on both the buyer and the seller side transactions in various industries. Most recently, she has owned and operated a franchise as a family business, and her business experience provides her with a unique perspective on the legal needs of a business and how to balance them with business priorities. Tabitha, as a background, she has a bachelor's in microbiology from the University of Florida and a JD from Chicago Kent College of Law. She's licensed in Illinois, admitted to the district courts of Colorado and Northern Illinois. So, welcome, Tabitha. Thank you so much for being here today. And just a word about what I do. I work in house as a general counsel for a technology company called Compunel Inc. I manage all legal operations and all legal aspects of the company. A general disclaimer, since this is a legal seminar, we want to say that this is what we are speaking today or what we are sharing with you today is general information and not legal advice. And any questions that you may have, please keep them general in nature without any specific names or references so that we maintain confidentiality and privacy. So with that, Tabitha, I hope you're ready to start off this discussion. Thank you again for joining us. So I know that we, in our audience and our members, we have many business owners or people who may be thinking of starting their own business, people in various walks of life. So today, let's just discuss on a basic level what are the requirements when someone is thinking about starting a business. And also, while we go through that, what are some of the risks and some of the things that we need to be careful of or calculated risks in each of these steps? So, with that, the first thing that comes to your mind, Tabitha, when we talk about someone, let's say I come to you and I say I want to start a business, where would you start?
Sure. So first of all, I just want to thank you so much for that introduction, and also thank you everyone for being very welcoming. It's definitely something I appreciate a lot, and also for attending as well. So yeah, if someone approached me, right, and they're looking to start a business, first thing that they really should be thinking about, besides what they want to do, what they want to sell, is how are they going to structure their business, right? So a lot of people, many times, like suppose you bake cakes and you sell them, you would just be doing it out of your home initially. You're not really thinking about the legal structure of anything. And that would be as a sole proprietor. Okay, so as a sole proprietor, there is no legal entity. You're doing it for yourself. The revenue that you make is going to be taxed as any other revenue that you would make. And the biggest thing with doing that is that you don't have any liability protection. Okay, so anytime
That's a big risk.
It's a huge risk. You're basically putting all of your personal assets on the line because you don't have an entity protecting you, right? So that's the first thing you want to look at. Of course, in the beginning, it might just be easy for you to say, hey, I'm going to start doing this business and I don't really want to deal with setting up the entity right now. I don't want to have to think about anything other than just doing the business, right? But you definitely want to take the time to go through that process of setting up an entity. So in terms of an entity, well, the other thing before I start that, I want to say, you can also have a partnership, right? So if you have two or more people, you can have a partnership. Maybe you even have an agreement between the partners, which you've signed, but you still don't have an entity. Okay, so in that case, one option you do have is something called a limited partnership. Now, a limited partnership, suppose there's two partners in the business. One partner is a silent investor. The other partner is active and runs the day-to-day of the business and manages it. Then that active partner is going to be the general partner, and the silent partner is going to be the limited partner. And the downfall is that the active partner has 100% liability in this situation. And it is an entity that you would need to register with whichever Secretary of State you choose to. But again, lots of liability for those active partners. So
again, risky option here.
Yes, very risky option. And there might be some limited circumstances where it works. For most people, that's not going to be the answer. Most people that come to me, they're usually small and mid-sized businesses, or they're just getting started off. The best option is probably going to be a limited liability company or an LLC. So that limited liability company, right, has pretty much a shield. It's a shield of protection from liability for any of the members of that liability company. The other advantage is that it has pass-through taxation, which means that any revenue that any earnings that the company has is going to be taxed as your income. Okay, so of course we're talking about the profits. So it's going to be taxed as your income. Of course, there is also self-employment tax that's going to be added on to that, right? But a limited liability company, you can also choose to have it taxed as an S Corp if you want. The benefit of that is that you can take out a salary. In fact, if you choose to be taxed as an S Corp, or if you are an S Corp, you are required to take a reasonable salary. Okay, so what that does is, of course, there you are taxed, you have to pay payroll taxes, but then any other dividends that you get from the company can be taxed at a lower rate. Okay, so that reduces your tax burden a little bit, especially depending on how much revenue and how much profits are in your business. So limited liability company generally works for most people. One thing you have to remember is limited liability company cannot have, shares or stock. Instead, it would be members or membership units. Now, if you decide to have investors, for example, in a limited liability company, you can have different classes of membership units, right? And those membership units can have different voting abilities. They can have different management abilities, right? So you can kind of detail what you want those different classes, what kind of rights that they should have in the operating agreement. But you do have that option, because I know sometimes, you as the primary owner, you want to manage everything. You put a lot of time, effort, and money into it already, but maybe you need a little bit of cash infusion. And in that case, you don't want that investor to be as active. So that's an option that's available for you. And then finally, you get into your S and C Corp, which are usually, so S Corp can work for some situations. So S Corp is going to be taxed, like I explained before, if you choose, just like if an LLC were to choose the S Corp designation. But it requires a board of directors, and you would need to have managers, okay, that are separate than the board of directors. And there are several rules on who can own an S corp and how many people can own an S corp. So it's limited to 100 shareholders. You cannot have corporations, LLCs, most type of trusts cannot be owners in an S corp, right? And usually it has to be citizens or residents of the U.S. as well. So you can see.
So it's limited in its applicability, in who can opt for an S corp, and also this notion of pass-through taxation, where you can have that applies, I believe, to the LLC in the LLC world, right?
Yes, yes, the pass-through corp taxation is for the LLC. Now, for an S corp and an LLC that's taxed as an S corp, you would need to take out a salary, right? If you are an active if you are active in the business, you would need to take out a salary. And then you take, I think that was one of the questions that just came in, you would have to pay payroll taxes on that salary. And it has to be a reasonable salary. So you can't, you can't be the manager of the business and take out like $10,000 a year because you want to reduce your tax burden, because that is something the IRS will look into. And then everything else, though, so you take a reasonable salary and then you have a distribution that you're paying out to yourself, then that will be taxed at a lower rate as regular income. Okay, so that's the benefit there. And then, of course, the final option is if you are a very large company, usually you have the option of being a C Corp. The downfall of a C Corp for most people that are not large companies is going to be that it's going to get taxed twice. So at the corporate level and also at the level of the shareholder.
Right, right. Yeah, so it's a careful consideration before even embarking on to your business venture, to think about what would really apply to your business model, your product, or your service that you are thinking about, getting into business with. Um, and of course, the procedural aspect of setting up these entities is different in each state, but pretty much I assume they are, not that difficult, fairly easy to set up. And what are the documents or what other things would you need in order for one to set up a business?
Sure. So one thing before I answer that, I just wanted to say, if you are thinking of investors right now or in the future, the entity that you choose is also going to affect that, right? So if you're an S Corp and you're thinking of having investors in the future that are maybe from India, for example, then you're going to be limited. That's going to be hard to do with an S Corp. So definitely keep that in mind. So in terms of what would you need to actually file for an entity, make it official, right? You're going to need to have an operating agreement. It's not always required by the state, right? Because it's something that governs how you interact with the other members. Like if you have an LLC, it's going to be with the other members. It's going to address different things like the governance of that entity. It's going to address how profits are shared, when are distributions made, how are major decisions made? Okay, what happens if a member passes away or becomes disabled, right? Does their son or daughter then get to be a member of the company, or do they just get the financial benefit of that, right? Because you don't always want, when it comes to transfers in any way, you want to make sure, especially in a closely held entity, you want to make sure that you can work with that person, that it's not necessarily going to be somebody that you dislike or might try to take over everything. Okay, you're also going to have to file articles of incorporation. That's very easy to do in most states. Just a very quick process. And then, of course, if you have a corporation instead of an operating agreement, you're going to have a shareholder agreement as well. So the shareholder agreement, similar to the operating agreement, is going to define that relationship with other shareholders and their relationship with the entity itself. And then, of course, you want to have a set of bylaws. The bylaws is going to govern how the entity operates. Okay. So there's two different sets of documents, but what I always recommend, especially for an LLC, is to get that operating agreement in place, especially if you have multiple partners involved.
Sure. And alongside that, of course, you'll need to think about the name of the company, make sure that it's available, get your domain name registration done, because in today's world, virtual presence is very important, no matter what kind of business you're in. So all those things are things that simultaneously need to be thought about and planned for. And what has your experience been in terms of these registrations? Are they fairly simple? What do you suggest?
Yeah, so most of the time, most people prefer to have an entity name, which is like, let's say ABC LLC. Okay. And then they're going to use a different name for their business, which might be um, New York Pizza. Okay. And that's your doing business as name. Now, there's a couple things to consider. So, one thing you want to think about, especially depending on what kind of business you have. Suppose you have a business where you're selling products, branded products, okay, and you plan on expanding that, you plan on having some brand recognition. You want to think about trademarks as well in this process. So when you pick a name for your business, okay, I know sometimes we like to think of descriptive things, maybe something related to where we live, like you could say. Chicago Northwest Pizzeria, right? That's descriptive. But what would be good for you to do in the beginning itself is come up with like a unique name for the business. Okay, something that's made up, something that doesn't exist out there. That's usually what is most favorable because you're going to have the greatest trademark protection from that. When you come up with your logo, same thing. You want to come up with something that is unique and new and it's not existing out there. And in that process, what you want to do is you want to search the state. So whatever state you're incorporated in, you're going to search their database for similar names. And you don't want anything that's already been registered. Although some states, will allow multiple names, like the state of Colorado allows multiple DBAs that are all the same, but most states will not allow it. Okay, so you want to check that. And then you also want to do a USPTO search for the trademark name. Okay, and anything similar as well. Make sure that it can be trademarked from the beginning and that you can protect it because there are times when we call them like trademark pirates, right? They notice your business getting successful and they will go register that name. And then you're going to have to basically take it to court in order to be able to use that name, which you came up with. So you need
I know
to,
there's one recent case where I think Taco Bell had to take someone to court because one of the products that they, introduced was already taken by someone. So they actually had to litigate and get that name back to be able to use it. So that's something very important to think about as well.
yeah, and along with that, any domain names, even if you plan on using it in the future. So if you have a certain company now, right? Like our company name had been Dreammaker Bath and Kitchen, then Dreammaker Bath and Kitchen, of course, .com is a name that domain that we want to have, but maybe we want to have DMBK, okay, .com for future use or anything like that, any variation thereof. So kind of think about it strategically, think what you're going to need to have, and buy that in the beginning, because there are times when you want it later on and someone's already bought it knowing that you might need to use it in the future, and then they're going to, try to price gouge for that domain.
Sure, sure, absolutely. I think these are all great tips. And the other thing I was going to add to this is to think about any other licensing or registration requirements based on your industry, right? And also the state specific requirements. Um, for example, if you are a women-owned minority business, some states do have provisions where you get certain advantage. There's also other registration requirements depending on the type of business you have. Like for example, consulting companies in New Jersey have a specific requirement with the Attorney General's office. So these type of requirements may not be that obvious, but it's important for you to think about it. And that's why a business lawyer like Tabitha is so important to consult when you're thinking about starting your business, because then you're getting all the information, making informed decisions, and moving forward with everything you have.
Yeah, and to add to that, so you're also going to have to, depending on the state that you're in, right? Some states require a sales tax number, or a sales permit, depending on the type of business you are. So you do want to check out those requirements before you start actually selling anything. Not all businesses are going to need to have that. Like if you're a digitally run business and you're not selling anything tangible, you probably don't need it. But if you are selling something tangible, then you should have it before you start your first sale. And then related to that is going to be that EIN. So as soon as you get the entity set up, you're going to go to the IRS site, and it literally takes like 5 minutes. Get your EIN set up. And again, any kind of state IDs that you might be required to have as well.
Sure, sure. This is all like, to set up the entity and all that. And of course, we need to make sure that there is sufficient financing, there's enough funds that are available for you to run the business. You have operating, budget that you have planned for. And sometimes it may mean that you might need a loan or need to get some help with financing. So, what are those options typically, Tabitha? Can you shine some light on it?
Yeah, so there's several different options. I think the first that usually comes to most people's mind, if you're not financing it yourself, is usually loans or maybe a line of credit. One thing to remember, especially if you are a new business owner and you have not been in business before, a lot of times to get those business loans, you're going to need to have 2 years of tax returns, business tax returns. And at that point, you're not going to have it. So it's good to start thinking about like alternative ways of financing. Now, if you are purchasing a business, or maybe you're looking at buying equipment for the business or anything like that, there's a possibility of getting an SBA loan. So SBA loans are generally more favorable because they are backed by the government. And they tend to be easier to get in certain circumstances than the traditional type of loans. With any type of loan that you get, you're going to look at the interest rate, but also most of these banks are going to make you sign a personal guarantee. Okay,
Right.
so
I was
just
going to say
talking
that
about
you will have to put up something in order to get this money.
exactly. And we were talking about how having an entity shields you from personal liability. Well, here is one circumstance where that's not necessarily true, right? Because as soon as you sign that personal guarantee, pretty much all of your assets are going to be on the line. Now, if we were talking about some different situations, like if you're negotiating with a franchisor, I would say try and negotiate that personal guarantee. I think most traditional lenders and, for SBA loans or for traditional loans as well. They're not going to be willing to negotiate that personal guarantee. A lot of times there's a possibility of just having some collateral instead of a blanket personal guarantee. You could have maybe a property that you own as collateral for the loan. But be prepared for that, right? And also, if you've been self-employed for several years, get those tax returns ready. Because those self-employed tax returns, if you have 2-3 years worth of it and you can show good income on them, get those ready. Again, what you want to think about when you're filing your taxes, if you're planning on having a business, sometimes reducing income on the taxes to reduce your tax burden is not what might be favorable in terms of getting those loans. So definitely think about that early on. Make sure that you're preparing for it years ahead if you need to, so that you're showing the higher income on those tax returns. So besides loans, if you're like a startup, you're looking to get investment, you can, of course, get investment either as an equity investor, right? You're adding them on in exchange for equity. You can also have a convertible note, or you can have a SAFE. So, of course, we all know equity investors, they give you a certain sum of money based on how you value the company, which might be hard to do. Like valuation for a startup, like how do you value a startup when you don't have any revenue, right? That's going to be based on an analysis that you do on future earnings and, the market.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so you'll definitely, if you're going that route, you're going to need somebody who's experienced in that industry, maybe who has experience raising capital in that industry to help you through that valuation. Because one key thing you don't want to do is undervalue yourself and give away equity, but you also don't want to scare away investors, right? So that's one option. The second option is what we call convertible debt. So convertible debt is essentially a loan that somebody gives you with the option to convert later on, convert into equity later on. You would still have to pay interest. There would be a maturity date on that debt. So if their interest has not converted into equity, then you would have to pay that loan by that date. And, it gives you money up front though. So that's an option. What's been common in the past 10 years or so in a lot of startups is something similar to a convertible note. That's the SAFE. Okay, so the SAFE is similar to a convertible note. And what it gives you is essentially money up front from the investor. There's no interest. And you would have to have trigger clauses in that note. Okay, so for example, when you do the next equity round, right, equity round of fundraising, then that note will convert into equity. Maybe there's a discount. So instead of $4 per share, maybe it's $3 per share, right? So there's a discount. That's also the case with a convertible note as well. You can have a discount there if you want to. And the benefit of a SAFE is that you don't have any interest. You don't have to do valuation upfront. So you don't have the risk of undervaluing yourself as a company, right? You can defer it to a time where you have more income, you have more information to make that valuation on as a company. Now, the risk is if you're an investor and maybe the startup fails, right? Then possibly it's not, you'll never get that money back because you're not treated as a creditor when you have a SAFE note, okay? And you definitely that's something as an investor you would have to be thinking about. And by the way, I keep saying safe. It means like simple agreement for future equity. Um, it's just a term that we use legally. It's just it's like any other note, right, with specific terms to it. So those are kind of the disadvantages. It lies more on the investor side than the company side. Of course, if you have multiple safe notes outstanding, then when you do future fundraising, right, you need to kind of keep in mind the dilution that you might have when they convert. So, and I know like sometimes you don't do that math up front, and then it takes you by surprise. So that is something to keep in mind.
Yeah, very interesting. And the other thing I have seen startups do is also where they have employees with stock options, is to do an employee stock option plan ahead of time. So the equity that the employees will get is actually taken out, or carved out already, so that when investors come in, it's not there's some amount of separation from what the employee stock options are versus future investors coming in at different stages of the business.
Mhm.
All right, so this is all great information that we are sharing, and I hope all of you are enjoying this discussion. And we talked a little bit about intellectual property protection and rights in terms of trademarks, logos, and branding. How about copyrights and patents? I think those would also, depending on your product, of course, and your service, you may want to think about that ahead of time as well.
Absolutely. So when you're thinking about copyrights, right, if you're producing any type of content, whether it's you're writing a book, you have films, maybe it's software. Software is an interesting area of copyright. Um,
Paintings, photographs,
yeah,
anything that you're creating.
exactly. So that's where you want to start thinking about copyright protection. You do want to make sure you have that protection ahead of time before it goes public, right? So that you're as protected from people basically stealing your work um, before you go public. Okay. So copyrights is super important to consider. Definitely, consult with a copyright attorney. So intellectual property is one of those things. I would say in the legal world, especially, you really need a specialized attorney for that because there is a whole process that you have to go through, and that specialization really helps. Now, when it comes to patents, most attorneys are going to be specialized in specific areas. So if you have some kind of electrical invention, you're going to go to an attorney who specializes in that. They probably have an electrical engineering bachelor's degree, right? They have to have one to be a patent attorney. So definitely consider that. Now, for patents, right, any kind of inventions, if you've invented a process, a product, a machine, anything like that is going to be patentable, right? Depending on what's already out there. They call it prior art. You want to go and check to see what's already out there and how can you properly protect that, right? So you want to, when you invent something, like I was in the pharmaceutical world, every 20 years, patents last 20 years generally. Usually, the first 7 to 8 years of that patent life is taken up by research and clinical trials and getting FDA approval. But then the remainder of that time is when it goes to market and starts making money. What do companies do at the end of that 20-year process? They reformulate, right? They reformulate in such a way that they can now get another patent and market that as a new product, right? But it might just be a slight improvement previous one. So, start thinking about that. If you have anything that is considered intellectual property that is valuable. Get all of that taken care of upfront. It is a little bit more expensive, right? Especially if you're thinking of starting a new business. But in the long run, I promise you, it's going to save you a lot of heartache.
So when do the protections start? Is it from the time you apply, or is it from the time it's processed? At what point can you say that, okay, I've put in my application, now I'm protected?
Yeah, so essentially, when you start that process, you date back what you do, right? So even if you don't have patent approval, you would be protected from the day that you file that application if you were the first person to file that patent. So what you do want to do is you want to file as soon as possible, right? Don't take your product live without having it, because what we know is a lot of products can be reverse engineered. And
Sure.
then it becomes very difficult if somebody else goes to file first, but you have not filed yet. It's hard to backdate that and get that protection.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and something important to think about as well. And then the next thing I was going to ask or discuss is, of course, we need additional protections in terms of insurance, various types of insurance, depending upon your line of work. You will have, several types of insurance, business insurance, liability insurance. So those are all things to consider and plan for, even in terms of how much they cost, because insurance does cost money. And if you have employees, if you're hiring people, whether as a W-2 employees or contractors, again, there's, workers' comp insurance that you'll have to, purchase as well. So can you talk a little bit about the various insurances that are applicable and any tips on how to go about that?
Yeah. So insurance is one thing I deal with a lot. So one of the areas that of businesses that I work with are family entertainment businesses, lots of liability. And, in businesses like that, um, different types of insurance are super important. Sometimes I've met with early business owners who forgo having insurance because it can be expensive, right? Depending on what you're doing as a business. But I always suggest, definitely go out, talk to insurance brokers, commercial insurance brokers specifically, about what kind of business you're doing and see what kind of protection you're going to need. Because a lot of times they're going to be able to see a lot of areas of liability that you might not even be aware of as a new business owner. Okay, so some types of insurance to consider: first, your general liability insurance. So this is, it protects you from lawsuits for injury, property damage, any other claims that might come against your business. Okay, and in addition to that, you probably should have an umbrella policy. So what an umbrella policy is that say your general liability is capped at $1 million, but damages for a particular lawsuit come in at $1.5 million, then the umbrella liability would cover that extra 500,000. Okay, so that's important to consider. And of course, you can figure out what kind of coverage you really want to have. Now, in terms of liability insurance, what you want to be thinking of, and again, talk to an insurance broker, talk to a business attorney, because certain industries have certain risks. For example, I have a client who has a sports facility that they just started. When we were reviewing their insurance policies, we found that they had included a clause in there which excludes transmissible diseases, okay, and infectious diseases. Of course, like if you go to a gym, one of the things, what are you concerned about? Athlete's foot, maybe staph infections. No matter how careful somebody is in cleaning the equipment, there's a possibility of that. another type of business, maybe you don't have to worry about that as much, and it would be okay to have that exclusion. So based on what you do as a business, you want to make sure that all of that is covered and there's not any hidden exclusion, which you find out about later on when you really need to have that coverage. Second type is workers' compensation. Okay, it's going to be mandatory in a lot of states. This covers medical expenses if something happens to one of your employees, lost wages for injured workers, right? So that's super important to have. Definitely talk to a broker about that and let them know how many employees you have and what kind of work they're doing as well, because workers' comp is based also on the type of jobs that they're doing. So if they're doing high risk jobs, like if you have somebody up on the roof, that's going to probably put your workers' comp much higher than somebody doing a desk job. Okay, then if you have a commercial property, always make sure you have property insurance, commercial property insurance, which covers damage to the property, to equipment inside, to any inventory, right? Again, look at the exclusions. That's super important when you're considering property insurance. Like if a storm comes through and ruins most of your inventory, is that covered? Is that inventory covered? So you want to make sure, that what you need is actually on that insurance policy. And I just saw a question here, if you're an LLC, a single member, do you need to have workers' comp? You don't. So if you're a single member LLC, you don't need to have workers' comp. But as soon as you do have employees, definitely start considering that. Talk to the broker and also check out the laws in your state on whether you need to have that particular type of insurance or not. Next, professional liability. If you're an accountant, medical doctor, an attorney, right? There's also other types of professions that need professional liability insurance, architects, right? So that's something to consider because maybe everyone's not perfect. There's always errors that happen and you want to be protected against that. Okay. Next, data liability, data protection, breach, cyber liability insurance. A lot of business owners forgo that. But in this day and age, I think you absolutely need to have it. It doesn't cost that much more on top of the other insurance policies you have, but it gives you a lot of protection because especially now with AI and the types of cyber attacks that are going on, you want to protect your customer data. And you don't want any kind of private sensitive information getting out. And also what happens if you as a business are, you have a cyber attack and it shuts down your computer system that you need to operate, right? Like what happens? So you want to consider this kind of cyber liability insurance, even if you think you don't need it. And finally, another key insurance to have is key person insurance. So if you have one or two people in the business who are the main operators, the main managers, what happens if something happens to one of them? If someone passes away, if they become disabled, right? It might take you some time, maybe a few weeks, maybe a few months to find a replacement for that person to get back on the feet. Maybe there's some revenue loss during that time. So, or other expenses because of their death or disability. And you want to have key person insurance to kind of bridge that gap when it happens. Because of course it's something that all of us, we don't know what the future is going to hold. So it's going to protect you in those situations. So these are just some of the very important insurances, but of course, depending on the industry you're in, you might also want to look into what else might be needed for your industry.
Sure, sure. There's so much we can talk about when it comes to business. For example, you know, employment agreements, contracts with vendors. These are all important documents that you want to make sure that the provisions in there are protecting you and protecting the business. So you definitely want to run all these documents by a business attorney who's well versed and who can advise you based on your business, your industry, as to what kind of clauses can you put in there, how can you protect, what is the governing law you want to put in the contract. And these are all things that are very, very critical in the long run, because you're doing all this to protect you when something goes wrong. When things are going right, you don't think about all these might look like an expense, but really these will come in handy when something goes wrong, and when you have that employee who might file a complaint, or there is an issue with the vendor and somebody doesn't pay you. Those are the times when the provisions in your agreements are important. So it's something to think about. Definitely consult a business attorney when you have issues that you are not familiar with or you are not an expert in. We would recommend that you do that. And anything else, Tabitha, that you'd like to add here? I know we're running out of time. I can't believe we already went through almost an hour, and I didn't even realize it. But anything else that's important that one should think about? I know we didn't talk about bank accounts and selection of a bank account and things like that, but I would think that's pretty basic.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much, I think for today, that's the final thing is that bank account, right? Make sure when you open up your business, open a bank account. I know a lot of times it's convenient to start receiving money in your own personal bank account and then, making expenses out of it. But you don't want to do that. You want to have that separation between personal and business banking. Um, if you have personal credit cards, don't use them for business, right? Get business credit cards for business use. Don't start spending money on that business credit card for personal reasons. Okay. And a lot of times I know we want to make those deductions on the tax returns. So when you make those deductions, you want to be able to go through your bank account. You want to go through your receipts that you have and be able to justify it as a business expense. And when you start kind of commingling the funds and the bank accounts, it can become quite messy later on. Most people don't expect to get audited by the IRS, but it does happen. And when it happens, you want to have clean bank accounts, you want to have clean credit card statements, and you want to be able to justify everything as a business expense. So start that practice early on, and it should be easy to keep up with.
Just like you should have your personal doctor on a speed dial, you really should have a business attorney and a CPA, a tax expert, on your side, so that you can reach out to them with any questions that you have. Because questions don't come announced, right? Sometimes they just pop up, and you may not have the time then to go look for someone. So early on, get that trusted attorney on your side. Have them on your retainer, get a tax professional, and make sure that you are protected by these individuals who are experts in their field and can give you the right advice. Any last words, Tabitha? And also, if you can please put your contact information on the chat for anyone that would like to reach out to you and get some advice, based on our discussion today. So please do that. And any ending parting words from you?
Yeah, I just want to say, when it comes to anything business related, anything really, especially in this country, that's legal, right? That might affect you personally in the future. Um, you want to get in touch with the right people, right? Like Prema said, whether it's a CPA or an attorney, make sure that you get in touch with them. We get a lot of clients that come in when it's a very urgent emergency situation that needs to be resolved ASAP, and it's going to cost a lot more at that point. than had they been proactive earlier on. So that's super important. Just, if you have questions, if you think like this is something that could come up in the future, definitely ask somebody that has a specialty in that field. And thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you for being welcoming. And, I really hope that I've kind of given you insight. And I know like Prema has tons of experience doing this. So I hope we've been able to kind of give you a little bit of a glimpse on what it takes to start a business, at least the beginning part of it.
Yes, absolutely. It was wonderful getting all the insight from you, Tabitha. If there are any other questions, definitely we can address them, or you can send it by email. I know that there is a avenue where you can reach out to the community services team that can then address your questions. Once again, thank you all for joining. And Tabitha, I think someone has a question for you.
So does your company help opening the business accounts? Do you mean the business bank accounts? So if
Let me
it's
make sure. I'll try to open them for asking questions because right now we kind of turned off to unmute once
okay.
again. And now, guys, I don't mention your name, but you can ask the question.
Yeah, thank you, Tavita, for the wonderful session. So my question is like, opening an LLC, for example, S corp or C corp, like that. Do you help setting up those companies, or?
Yes, we do. We do. So a lot of times, depending on the complexity of it, right? I will tell you, if you are a single member LLC, you can do it very easily online. But you do, once you start having more people involved, that's probably when you want to get an attorney involved. So you can get that operating agreement and bylaws in place and make sure that you have the dispute resolution and everything ironed out for the future. Okay, because I know like a lot of times you go into business with partners on very friendly terms, and it would be great if it's always like that, but many times, things do come up which might change the nature of that relationship. So yes, we do help you. You can reach out to me if you need anything.
Sure. Okay, maybe I will reach out either to your email address or reach out by contact.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll look forward to it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. If there are no further questions, I think we can conclude today's session. We appreciate Mata once again, for giving us this platform to be able to present these legal seminars. See you again next time with a different topic and an expert in that field.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.